Hello and welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, a show about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. The new year is right around the corner, and our story today is about the Brommtopp, a New Year's Eve mumming tradition that was once popular among Mennonites in southern Manitoba. The tradition of mumming typically involves a troupe of performers who dress up in costume and travel from house to house in their community, performing jokes and songs in exchange for food, drink, or money. Mumming usually happens around Christmas or New Year's Eve. Mumming is not unique to Mennonites, but the Mennonite version of the tradition is called the Brommtopp. Mennonite mumming traditions are thought to date back all the way to the 16th century. The Brommtopp came to Canada with the Mennonite migration in the 1870s. I reached out to Roland Sawatsky, curator of history at the Manitoba Museum and a past curator at the Mennonite Heritage Village Museum in Steinbach.
From what I can gather, it has its origins across Northern Europe and Netherlands and Prussia as well. What's now Poland, of course. And then it was brought by the Mennonites from those areas to southern Russia, and then from there to Manitoba.
In Manitoba, it seems that the Brommtopp custom was largely continued by Mennonites originating from the Brommtopp colony, who created communities on the east and west sides of the Red River. By the 1950s, however, its popularity had declined. Today, the Brommtopp is mostly performed at special events rather than as a New Year's Eve tradition. The term Brommtopp refers to the Mennonite tradition, but it's also the name of the instrument used in the performance. The Brommtopp, or rumbling pot, is a type of friction drum. When played, it produces a low buzzing sound. This strange, unmusical sound was the only accompaniment to the Brommtopp lied, or the Brommtopp song, that the troupe performed.
It's a very interesting instrument, and it basically acts as a drone. So it's a low rumbling single tune that is underneath the singing of the troupe.
The Brommtopp is made by stretching a cowhide over the open end of a barrel. Small cuts are made in the center of the cowhide so that a long whisk of horsehair can be drawn through. If the troupe members couldn't get horsehair, rope or fiddle strings might be used instead. Here's Jake Schwartz talking about a Brommtopp he made in 1976 for a centennial celebration in New Bergtal, Manitoba.
What's it made of? Well, you can see it's wood. You know, this is a barrel about 40 years ago when Father went to town to get a load of coal in fall. He'd come home also with a barrel of apples, good old spy apples. That's what's in here. This is a barrel of that kind. Well, we found an old cow hide, and I soften it up and thin it down and just pull it over this barrel with some braces in between, and I let it dry. And where do you get horsehair? Well, the rancher west of town. And he brought me enough hair for another 1,000 things like this, a weird thing. Tell me an English word for Brommtopp, and then you do good.
The troupe would then learn and practice the Brommtopp song, and perhaps a few other holiday songs. They would also prepare their costumes. The costumes were usually silly and extreme. Sometimes they dressed as women or as cultural stereotypes that would be considered offensive today. They painted their faces or wore masks along with hats, wigs, and fake facial hair. Here again is Roland Sawatsky talking about the Brommtopp costumes.
It was often very loose clothing that they would wear because it would be freezing cold, and so they would bulk up underneath with layers. What I see in the photographs are people in clown costumes with painted faces and strange floppy hats. I see people wearing women's clothing as well, but there was often at least one person dressed as a woman, often with some padding to make one look particularly chubby. And then the masks themselves would be quite garish, large noses, huge eyes. If it wasn't just face painting, special goggles that made your eyes look big and white and quite aggressive. There's a harlequin element to some of them, strange hats. And then you also have some ethnic costumes, which of course are unacceptable today few of the gentlemen looked like they were pretending to be indigenous people, particularly a chief with a bonnet and regalia. Perhaps French Métis. This person looks like he might be wearing some sort of a Chinese mask as well. So there was some of that too, which unfortunately isn't surprising. It was quite common in that period. And then in the picture I have from Saskatchewan, we have men with long conical hats with stripes on them.
The goal was to be completely unrecognizable, which was not an easy task in a small village. Members of a Brommtopp troupe probably often performed for people who knew them well, including their families and friends. With their Brommtopp made, their songs rehearsed, and their costumes ready, the performing troupe, also known as Brommtopp Spieler or Brommtopp players, were ready to hit the town. They traveled from house to house in a horse-drawn sleigh or by foot, lugging their Brommtopp with them. Their means of transport meant that they couldn't travel very fast or very far, and they often planned out their route in advance, choosing which houses to go to. At each house, the Brommtopp Spieler would knock and ask to be invited in. If they were accepted, they would go inside the house, slogging snow and muck in with them, and set up their Brommtopp. The Brommtopp player's technique involves sliding the horsehair, which is covered in resin, between the thumb and index finger. Pouring water over the horsehair while playing created just the right amount of friction, making the cowhide vibrate and producing a low, rattling, buzzing sound. Often, Brommtopp performers would hold the barrel to vibrate against the door of a house to make the sound even more intense.
Yeah, there would be a little plank attached to the bottom of it with divots at the ends of the plank, and you would actually put it onto the doorknob of a house. And then while it's rumbling, it would make the entire door shake.
Accompanied by the droning sound of the Brommtopp, the troupe would perform the Brommtopp song for their hosts. The song has many variations, and both the melody and the verses might differ from village to village in Manitoba. But the most common version performed by Mennonites in Canada comes from a Low German text that originated in the Vistula Delta in present-day northern Poland. The verses of the Brommtopp song typically describe New Year's wishes for the inhabitants of the household, and are sometimes tongue-in-cheek. Some versions also have a verse about the making of the Brommtopp.
I think it's more just, a rhyme aimed at the family and the notion of the family and making fun of the family. So kind of crude, earthy, typically Low German language, and very much about the farm and master, the mistress, the daughter, the son. You go through the whole family.
Sometimes a Brommtopp troupe would write new lyrics about specific people in the community as a way of calling out people and teasing them. Here's local historian Ed Cron relating what John C. Reimer told him about the Brommtopp tradition among Mennonites who settled east of the Red River.
Verses would point out that somebody may have done something that they shouldn't have in the community, but they wanted the person to know that it didn't go on unseen. It had been seen by the community. So sometimes there was a verse that would talk about what the person had done. At the results of that, Mr. Reimer said that sometimes what happened was they would say, "Here is a little bit more schnapps for you, or a few more coins that we can give you. Could you please not sing that verse at the next place you're stopping at?"
Recordings of Brommtopp songs are hard to find, but we do have one recording from New Bergtal's centennial anniversary in 1976. Here's the Friesen family playing the Brommtopp and performing a version of the Brommtopp song.
Einen schönen guten Abend beten wir euch an. Einen schönen guten Abend beten wir euch an. Schönen guten Abend, eine fröhliche Zeit, weil wir uns haben den Brommtopp bereit, weil wir uns haben den Brommtopp bereit. Wir wünschen dem Herrn einen goldenen Tisch, auf alle vier Ecken eingebrannt.
Once the Brommtopp players had finished their performance, the troupe expected gifts of food and drink from their hosts. Portseltje, or New Year's cookies, were commonly served along with wine or hard liquor. Money was sometimes also given if the hosts could afford it, but food and drink were more common offerings. After the Brommtopp troupe was compensated for their performance, it was time for them to move on to the next home, leaving their hosts to clean up the mess of snow and water that they left behind. But according to Roland Sawatsky, some troupes ended their performances a little differently. Here Roland describes a scene in one of the few historical photos that exist.
They are pictured with the Brommtopp. You have whips, a person with a whip. And the story is that they would go into the house. They would first announce themselves with the Brommtopp, and then they would go in the house and sing with the Brommtopp. And some of them would act crazy. And then they would act out more and more and could be quite rude to the hosts. And then the leader with the whip would start whipping them in the house. And they would all run out yelling and then run to the next house or take the sleigh or the car to the next yard. And this was, a way to sort of end the festivities before anything got too out of control. But he was also part of the troupe. And that was his job, is to sort of put an end to things at some point.
The Brommtopp was generally considered to be all in good fun among the adult hosts, although women were less thrilled about the mess the performers left for them to clean up. But for the children, the experience was often terrifying. Strangers came into their homes, dressed in bizarre costumes, and played an instrument that could at best be called inharmonious. The Brommtopp tradition began to decline in the 1940s and 50s. As villages grew, people no longer knew everybody living in their community, and they became less willing to invite disguised strangers into their family homes, especially when those strangers would make a lot of noise and a lot of mess. Automobiles also became more common. Young people could drive to other communities for fun activities, and would-be performers didn't have to rely on traditions like the Brommtopp for entertainment.
It seems to have dwindled in popularity in the late 1950s. And that's also a period of sort of evangelical growth among Mennonites. And the Brommtopp is such a secular, strange thing that they might have just thought, okay, this is really too old world spooky for us, and we shouldn't be dabbling in this kind of thing. I've heard one person consider it the work of the devil.
Physical examples of the Brommtopp instrument are on display at the Mennonite Heritage Village Museum in Steinbach and at the Commons Barn in the historic Mennonite village of New Bergtal. Photos of Brommtopp performers, as well as a recording of Brommtopp performances, are held at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. To see some of these images online or to hear this episode again, go to mharchives.ca. If you have questions or comments about this program, dash them off in an email to us at info@mharchives.ca. Join us again next week for a story about Der Friedensfürst, or Prince of Peace, an English-language Christmas song that became near and dear to Russian Mennonites after it was translated into German.
Hi, I'm Conrad Stace, the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Thanks to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Mennonite Church Canada. This program is made possible through support from Golden West Radio and listeners like you. To support the program and the work of the archives, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support.
This episode was researched by Kaylee Dyck, Conrad Stace, and was written by Kaylee Dyck. Thanks to Roland Sawatsky and Ed Cron for chatting with us about the Brommtopp. We're also grateful to ethnomusicologist Dr. Judith Clausen, whose research on the Brommtopp tradition in southern Manitoba was invaluable. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.